My name is Cole. I'm 42 years old. For 12 of those years, I was a Navy SEAL. When you do that job, you learn a few things. You learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. You learn that the human body can be pushed a lot further than the mind thinks it can. And you learn to observe. You learn to see the world not as a landscape, but as a set of problems and solutions, threats and cover. You see the bent blade of grass, the fresh mud on a rock, the unnatural silence in a forest that should be alive with sound. Your reality is built on a foundation of tangible, observable facts. You don't deal in hypotheticals. You don't have time for ghosts or monsters. You deal with the man with the gun, the hidden IED, the physical threat in front of you. After I got out, I tried a few things, but the only thing that really stuck was using those skills in the civilian world. I started a small consulting business. Security assessments for high net worth individuals with remote properties, that sort of thing. It was quiet work. It paid the bills. It kept me outdoors, away from the crowds. I preferred the company of trees to people most days. I'm telling you all this so you understand that I am not, by nature, a man given to flights of fancy. I've never seen a UFO. I don't believe in Bigfoot. My world is governed by the laws of physics and the predictable, if sometimes brutal, laws of nature. What I'm about to tell you is something that I can't fit into that world. It violates every principle I've built my life on. It sounds like a fever dream, like something cooked up by a guy who spent too much time alone in the woods. I know how it sounds, but it happened. And it's important that I tell it right. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I share stories like this regularly. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always like to know who's listening. All right, let me tell you what happened. It started with a job in the Pacific Northwest. A tech billionaire had bought a massive tract of land, thousands of acres deep in the Cascade Mountains bordering a national forest. The kind of place where you can drive for 2 hours on a private road after you leave the last paved one. My job was simple. Walk the property line, assess it for vulnerabilities, poachers mostly, and map out access points. It was a 3-week contract, just me, my gear, and the deep woods. The property itself was beautiful in a raw, intimidating kind of way. Towering Douglas firs and cedars that formed a canopy so thick it felt like twilight even at high noon. The ground was a spongy carpet of moss and ferns, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, pine resin, and decay. It was the kind of quiet that has a weight to it. A constant, soft hiss of rain on leaves, the gurgle of unseen creeks, but no human sounds. Not a plane, not a distant car. Nothing. For the first few days it was routine. I set up a base camp near an old logging road, and each morning I'd head out on a grid search pattern. I found signs of deer, elk, the occasional bear scat. Normal. But on the 4th day, I was working my way up a narrow, steep-sided valley on the northern edge of the property, and things started to feel off. It started with the silence. Not the deep woods quiet I was used to, but a dead silence. The birds were gone, the squirrels, the chipmunks. All the little noises of the forest floor had just stopped. It was like walking into a soundproofed room. The air was still and cold. My training kicked in. That kind of sudden silence means one thing: predator. A big one. A cougar, maybe, or a bear. I slowed my pace, started paying more attention to the world around me, my hand resting on the holstered pistol on my hip. It was more habit than anything else. I wasn't genuinely worried, but the feeling persisted. It was a prickling on the back of my neck, the kind that tells you you're being watched. I scanned the ridges above me, the dense thickets of alder and vine maple. Nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. It felt like I'd walked into someone else's house without knocking. I pushed deeper into the valley, following a creek bed. That's when I found the first tracks. They were in a patch of soft mud near the water, and my first thought was that a person had been walking barefoot. But that made no sense. They were too long, the heel too narrow, and the toes were tipped with deep impressions, like claws had dug in. My brain tried to make it a black bear walking on its hind legs for a few steps, but the stride was all wrong. The tracks were too far apart, a consistent bipedal gait for at least 20 yards before they disappeared onto the rocky ground. It wasn't a bear. The weight distribution was wrong. I took pictures, made a note in my log, and tried to dismiss it. A hoaxer, maybe. Some local messing with the new rich guy. But out here, miles from anywhere, it didn't sit right. Later that day, I found the claw marks. They were on a massive old-growth cedar about 9 feet off the ground. 3 deep gouges in the bark, each as thick as my thumb. I've seen what bears can do to a tree. This was different. The force required to do that was immense, and the height was just wrong. I'm 6'1", and I had to reach up to put my fingers in the lowest groove. No bear stands up and does that. They mark territory, sure, but not like this. This felt less like a marking and more like a display of sheer destructive power. The unease I'd been feeling all day began to curdle into something colder. My brain was a machine built for pattern recognition, and the patterns here were not adding up to anything I knew. That night, back at my camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I sat by my small fire, my back to a rock face, scanning the darkness beyond the light. The woods were still dead quiet. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, my old instincts getting jumpy from the isolation. But I knew it wasn't true. I've spent months alone in hostile territory. I know the difference between solitude and being stalked. The next morning I found a deer, or what was left of it. It was just off a trail I'd used the day before, so it was fresh. It hadn't been eaten, not in the way a cougar or a bear would feed. It was just broken. Its neck was snapped at an impossible angle, and its rib cage had been ripped open with such force that the ribs were splayed out like a grotesque flower. Nothing had fed on it. It was just a kill. A message. I stood there for a long time, the cold mountain air doing nothing to stop the sweat on my brow. This was not an animal I knew. This was something else. The job was no longer about finding poachers. I unslung the rifle I'd been carrying, a lightweight .308, and chambered a round. The smooth, metallic click was a small comfort in the profound silence. I was no longer just surveying the land. I was now hunting whatever had left that deer. Or, and the thought came to me unbidden and cold, it was hunting me. I decided to change my tactics. I abandoned the grid search and started moving like I was in hostile territory. Slow, quiet, using cover, spending more time listening than moving. I was tracking now, but I was also making myself a harder target. For 2 days I followed the signs. More of the strange, elongated tracks, broken branches too high for any normal animal to reach, and that smell. It would come and go on the wind, a thick, musky scent of wet fur, old blood, and something else. Something acrid and vaguely reptilian. It was a smell that triggered a primal response deep in my brain, the part of the brain that knows predators. I set up a hide on the second night, on a ridge overlooking the valley where I'd found the first tracks. I had a clear field of view for about 400 yards. I settled in for a long wait, using my night vision monocular to scan the darkness. The moon was a sliver, and the woods were a landscape of gray and black shapes. For hours, nothing. Just the wind sighing through the pines. Then, around 0200, I caught movement at the far end of the clearing. I focused the NVG, my heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. It stepped out from behind a curtain of old man's beard moss. It was not a bear. My mind, desperately trying to categorize what I was seeing, just short-circuited. It was on all fours at first, moving with a low, loping gait. The limbs were too long. The joints seemed to bend at odd angles. It was massive, bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen, bigger than a grizzly. Its fur was dark, matted. It stopped at the creek and lowered its head to drink. And then it stood up.
It just rose onto two legs as easily as a man getting out of a chair. It had to be 8 feet tall. The shoulders were impossibly broad, tapering down to a lean waist. The legs were digitigrade, bent like a dog's, but it stood on them perfectly balanced. The head was purely canine, a long snout, pointed ears. It turned its head, sniffing the air, and I saw the glint of its eyes through the green haze of the night vision. It knew something was out there. It was testing the wind. My brain was screaming, "Guy in a suit! It's a guy in a suit!" But the proportions were wrong. The movement was too fluid, too animalistic. No human could replicate that powerful, predatory grace. And the sheer size of it. It was a monster from a storybook, standing in a moonlit clearing 400 yards away from me. It dropped back to all fours, a single, seamless motion of terrifying power, and melted back into the trees. I stayed in that hide until the sun came up, my rifle clutched in a white-knuckled grip, replaying that impossible image over and over in my head. The hunt changed then. It became an obsession. I wasn't just doing a job anymore. I had to know what that thing was. I spent the next week tracking it, living off my rations, barely sleeping. It was the most challenging track of my life. The creature was smart, incredibly smart. It used the terrain to its advantage, walked on rock to hide its prints, used creek beds to mask its scent. Several times I'd be following a clear trail only to have it vanish completely, and a few hours later I'd find its tracks paralleling my own. It was circling back. It was watching me watch it. We were hunting each other. This was no dumb animal. This was an intelligent, territorial apex predator, and I was deep inside its territory. I was the intruder. I started to feel a strange kind of respect for it. It was a master of its environment. It was what I had been trained to be, but it was born to it. On the 10th day, I found what looked like a den, a deep fissure in a rock face, partially hidden by a waterfall. The smell was overpowering there. Piles of bones, deer, elk, what looked like a cougar, were scattered around the entrance. This was its lair. I didn't go in. That would have been suicide. But I set up an observation post on the cliffs opposite, about 500 yards away, and settled in to wait. I wanted to see it again in the daylight. I wanted to confirm that I wasn't going crazy. I waited for 2 days. On the afternoon of the 12th day, it emerged. It stepped out into the misty spray of the waterfall, and I got my first clear look at it. The sight stole the breath from my lungs. It was even bigger than I'd thought. The fur was a dark charcoal gray, patched with black. Its muscles moved like thick cables under the hide. It had hands. Not paws, but five-fingered hands, thick and powerful, ending in black, heavy claws. It stretched, arching its back, and the movement was so disturbingly human that my skin crawled. Its head was the stuff of nightmares. A wolf's head, yes, but the brow was heavy, intelligent, and the eyes. They weren't the simple, reactive eyes of an animal. They were a pale, cold yellow, and they were scanning the opposite cliff face. They were scanning my position. It knew. I don't know how, but it knew I was there. It locked its gaze right on my position. It couldn't see me. I was in a ghillie suit, tucked into the rocks. But it knew. It stared for a long, unnerving minute. Then it let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the rock I was lying on. It wasn't a warning. It was a challenge. And then it started moving. It didn't run into the woods. It started climbing the cliff face toward me. The confrontation I'd been seeking was now coming for me, and I was not ready for it. I had imagined a careful stalk, a long-distance shot, a controlled engagement. What happened was pure, vertical chaos. This thing, this creature, it scaled the sheer rock wall with a speed and agility that defied physics. It used those powerful clawed hands and its digitigrade legs to find purchase where there was none, moving like some kind of monstrous insect. I scrambled back from the edge of the cliff, my heart hammering against my ribs. My sniper perch was now a trap. I grabbed my rifle and started falling back, trying to put distance between us. The sound of it climbing was terrifying. The scrape of claws on stone, the shower of dislodged pebbles, and a series of low, guttural huffs, the sound of a massive engine working at full capacity. I was a trained operator, conditioned for combat stress, but this was different. This was like being hunted by a demon. The fear was primal. It bypassed all my training and hit me right in the lizard brain. I ran. I moved through the dense forest, back toward a box canyon I had mapped a few days prior. It was my only tactical option, a defensible choke point. I could get my back to a wall and force it into a frontal assault. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one I had. I could hear it crashing through the undergrowth behind me. It was faster than me, much faster. The only thing that saved me was the terrain. I was smaller and could weave through the thick trees while it had to smash its way through. I reached the canyon just as the sun was beginning to set, the light failing fast under the canopy. The canyon was a narrow slit in the rock, maybe 40 feet wide, with sheer walls rising 100 feet on either side. It ended in a solid rock face about 200 yards in. I backed into it, found a small alcove that offered some cover, and raised my rifle. I could hear it approaching the entrance. The crashing sound stopped. Silence. It was being cautious now. Smart. It knew it was walking into a kill zone. The shadows grew long and the temperature dropped. I was drenched in sweat, my breath pluming in the cold air. I strained my ears, listening for any sound. Nothing. Just the blood pounding in my ears. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows at the canyon entrance. It was there. It stood on two legs, a towering silhouette against the fading gray light. It just stood there, watching me, its head slightly cocked. It wasn't rushing in. It was studying the situation. The intelligence in that posture was more terrifying than any charge. It took a slow step forward, then another. The sound of its claws clicking on the stone floor of the canyon echoed in the enclosed space. It was in no hurry. It knew I was trapped. It knew it had me. My rifle was steady in my hands. The crosshairs of the scope settled on its center mass,
a target the size of a barrel lid. My training took over, a calm, cold voice in the back of my head.
Steady breathing. Squeeze, don't pull. One shot. My finger tightened on the trigger. I had it, dead to rights. But I couldn't shoot. For the first time in my life, in a situation that demanded lethal force, I hesitated. Because as I looked at it through the scope, at the intelligent, patient yellow eyes, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. To kill, it felt wrong. It felt like more than killing an animal. It felt like murder. It felt like sacrilege. It kept walking toward me, slow and deliberate. 50 yards, 40, 30. The smell was suffocating now, a physical presence in the air. I could see the muscles in its chest and shoulders contracting with each step. I could hear its breathing, a low, wet rumble like distant thunder. It stopped about 20 yards from me. It was so close I could see the individual coarse hairs on its snout, the faint steam of its breath in the cold air. It raised its head and looked directly at me, directly into my eyes. And then it happened, the thing that broke me. It didn't roar. It didn't growl. A sound came from its throat, a low, rasping vibration, a crude attempt to form a word with a mouth not designed for it. The sound it made was a gravelly, inhuman whisper. Leave. But the word was just the carrier wave. The real communication happened inside my head. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a thought, a concept pushed directly into my consciousness with the force of a physical blow. The meaning was far more complex than the single word it spoke. It was a feeling of immense age, of ancient ownership. It was the absolute, unquestionable certainty of a landlord telling a bug to get out of his house. There was no anger in it, no malice, just a bottomless, weary impatience. An authority so profound and ancient it made my own existence feel like a flicker of dust in a sunbeam. It wasn't a threat. A threat implies the possibility of failure. This was a statement of absolute fact. This is my domain. You are nothing. You will leave now. In that instant, my entire world, my training, my skills, my belief in my own abilities, my place at the top of the food chain, all of it crumbled into dust. I was not a hunter. I was not a threat. I was a child with a toy who had wandered into the path of something vast and eternal. My finger went slack on the trigger. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered the barrel of the rifle until it was pointing at the ground. It was the most difficult physical act of my life. Every instinct, every ounce of training was screaming at me to fire. But the part of me that had received that communication knew it would be a futile, meaningless gesture. It would be like a gnat stinging an elephant. The creature watched me, its yellow eyes unblinking. It registered my submission. It gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then, with a terrifying, fluid grace, it turned. It didn't run. It simply walked away, its long, powerful strides eating up the ground. It reached the mouth of the canyon, merged with the shadows, and was gone. The silence it left behind was more profound than any noise. I stood there in the alcove, shaking uncontrollably. Not from fear, not anymore. It was a deeper, more fundamental shock, the kind that rewires your brain. I didn't move for what felt like hours. I finally slid down the rock wall and sat there in the dark and the cold, my rifle across my lap, my entire understanding of reality shattered into a million pieces. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, replaying that moment, that word, that feeling, the sheer, crushing weight of its ancient authority. Dawn eventually came, painting the canyon walls in pale, washed-out colors. The world looked the same, but it was different. It was a stage, and I had just been shown a glimpse of what was really moving the scenery around behind the curtain. I got to my feet, my muscles stiff and aching.
I walked out of the canyon without looking back. The hike out of the property was a blur. I didn't stop, didn't rest. I just put one foot in front of the other. The forest no longer felt like a place of solitude and peace. It felt alien. It felt like someone else's home, and I was acutely, painfully aware that I was trespassing. When I finally reached my vehicle, I threw my gear in the back and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town. I called the client from a payphone. I told him the job was done. I invented a story about a large, unusually aggressive bear pack that had become territorial. I said I'd hazed them out of the area using non-lethal means, but that I strongly recommended he fence off that entire northern section of the property. For liability reasons. I told him it was geologically unstable and not safe for his family or guests. I lied. I lied through my teeth because the truth was impossible. How do you tell a man a monster from a dark fairy tale lives on his land and told you to get out? He was happy with the report. He wired the rest of my fee. I terminated the contract and never spoke to him again. I drove home, a 3-day trip, in a state of numb disbelief. I didn't tell anyone. Who could I tell? My old teammates? They'd think I had a PTSD-induced breakdown. The police? They'd laugh me out of the station. I was alone with this impossible knowledge. It's been 2 years since that day. The impact on my life has been total. I sold my consulting business. I sold most of my high-end gear. The rifle I had in that canyon is still in my safe, but I haven't fired it since. I can't bring myself to go into the deep wilderness anymore. A walk in a state park is about all I can handle. That feeling of being at home in the wild, of being a competent and capable part of that environment, is gone forever. I learned that day that I am not at the top of the food chain.
Humanity is not at the top of the food chain. We just live in the well-lit rooms of the house and have convinced ourselves that nothing lives in the attic or the basement. We are tenants, living on borrowed time, under the illusion that we are the landlords. That's the real thing that broke me, not the fear. It was the complete and utter demolition of my perspective. I spent my life training to be an apex predator, and in one moment, I was shown that I was nothing more than an insect. I've spent countless sleepless nights researching, going down rabbit holes of folklore and cryptozoology. Dogman, skinwalker, wendigo. Every culture has a name for it, a story about a man-wolf creature that haunts the deep woods. But the stories are all wrong. They paint it as a mindless beast, a creature of rage and bloodlust. What I met was not mindless. It was ancient, intelligent, and powerful in a way I have no words for. It wasn't evil, it was just sovereign.
It was there because it belonged there, and I was there because I didn't. That feeling it projected into my head. Leave. It wasn't just about that canyon, that piece of property. I feel it now as a much larger warning. We push farther and farther into the last wild places on this planet, with our drones and our satellites and our arrogance, mapping and cataloging and claiming everything we see. We think we're conquering nature. We're not. We're just knocking on doors that we should have left alone. And eventually, something is going to answer. For me, it did. So why talk about it now, after 2 years of silence? Because I'm worried. I see the news stories, the strange disappearances in national parks that get written off as animal attacks or people getting lost. The increasing number of eyewitness accounts, dismissed as hoaxes by people who have never spent a night alone in the real, deep woods. Something is changing. I don't know if we're pushing them out of their territories or if they're just getting less patient with us. But the barrier between their world and ours feels like it's getting thinner. I'm not sharing this story for attention. God knows I don't want it. I'm sharing this as a warning. From one outdoorsman to another, from one person who thought he understood the world to anyone who will listen. If you're out there in the backcountry and you get that feeling, that prickle on your neck, that sudden unnatural silence when the birds stop singing, listen to it. Don't try to be a hero. Don't let your ego tell you you're being paranoid. That feeling is the oldest survival instinct we have. It's your ancient animal brain telling you that you are no longer the predator. You are prey. Turn around. Go back to your car. Go back to the lights and the noise and the safety of the world we've built. Because you have no idea what is watching you from the shadows.
You have no idea what you might be trespassing on. I don't know what that thing was. An undiscovered species? A relic from a bygone age? Something from another dimension? I've given up trying to put a label on it. It doesn't fit in any of the boxes we have. And that's the most terrifying part. It exists outside of our understanding. The thing that haunts me the most, the image that flashes behind my eyes when I try to sleep, isn't the claws or the teeth or the sheer size of it. It's the eyes, those pale, intelligent yellow eyes. They weren't filled with rage. They weren't filled with hunger. They were filled with a kind of ancient, weary patience. It was the look of a groundskeeper who has watched generations of noisy children run across his lawn, knowing that eventually they all go home. He knows the lawn is his, and it will be his long after the children are gone. We're those children, and we're making a lot of noise, and I think the groundskeeper is starting to get tired of it.